Welcome to this explainer. It's pretty fascinating to think about how different faiths actually handle the physical, historical evidence behind their foundational texts. Today, we're diving deep into Marc Bates' historical critical analysis of Islamic origins, and we'll be looking at how that framework contrasts with biblical promise plan theology. We're going to explore some really profound questions about what exactly happens when sacred traditions are forced to meet the modern magnifying glass of history.
For the longest time, both Western scholars and Islamic tradition shared this core assumption that early Islam was transparently documented. The French scholar Ernest Renan actually hit the nail on the head regarding the academic mood back in 1851 when he famously claimed that Islam arrived in the full light of history. For generations, people just assumed we had this near-perfect window into the 7th century, but as the author of our source essay argues, modern historical scrutiny, using tools like paleography, codicology, and archaeology, well, it put some really serious sustained pressure on that old assumption.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the standard Islamic narrative. Second, scrutinizing the physical evidence. Third, the Islamic dilemma. Fourth, the promise plan alternative. And finally, two views of revelation.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the standard Islamic narrative.
To really grasp this narrative, we have to start with a concept called Inlibration. In classical Sunni dogmatics, primary revelation is located in this idea of an uncreated, letter-perfect Arabic book that was dictated and preserved absolutely flawlessly from a heavenly tablet. To put that into perspective, just as Christians believe the Word of God became flesh in a person, classical Islamic theology claims the Word of God became a physical book. That is an incredibly high bar, right? It literally treats letter-perfect immutability as a strict, non-negotiable condition of the revelation itself.
But here is where the historical rubber meets the road. There is actually a massive historiographical gap over 2 centuries between Muhammad's traditional death in 632 CE and the earliest edited biographies and canonical collections. Think about it this way. That would be like someone trying to write a forensically inspectable history of the American Revolution today, but only using oral traditions that had literally never been written down before. Now, oral cultures are incredibly strong, for sure, but the author points out that a gap of this magnitude makes it exceptionally difficult to support the claim of a publicly inspectable, letter-perfect written record stemming straight from the 630s.
Moving on to Section 2, let's talk about scrutinizing the physical evidence.
We really need to anchor ourselves with this one foundational term, Rasm. Early Arabic was originally written as this ambiguous consonantal skeleton. It completely lacked the short vowel marks and diacritical dots that we rely on today to fix things like case, mood, and pronunciation. Just imagine looking at the English consonants B and D on a page. Depending on the vowels you decide to add in centuries later, that exact same skeleton could mean bad, bed, or bid. Because of this built-in ambiguity, what the physical page actually said and what the later recitation tradition claimed it said are historically distinguishable things.
So the physical text evolved significantly over time. It transitioned all the way from that unpointed fluid Rasm up to the fully vocalized 1924 Cairo print standardization that everyone uses today. And the source essay brings up some fascinating archaeological findings here, like the Sanaa Palimpsest. Now, a palimpsest is essentially a manuscript where an earlier, differing text was literally scraped off the parchment just so it could be overwritten with a newer, standardized version. Evidence like this, along with early folios that show physical erasures, reveals a highly layered, very human, historical process of standardization.
And beyond just the manuscripts, there are external historical pressures that further challenge this traditional portrait of a globally visible Meccan origin. It's kind of like a giant puzzle where some pieces just don't fit the box. For instance, Mecca is completely absent from contemporary 6th and 7th century trade itineraries. Plus, the agricultural vocabulary used in the Quran, it actually better fits a northern Levantine ecology, think olives and vines, rather than a barren desert environment. We also see that the earliest non-Muslim historical notices mention Arab conquerors up in Palestine, not a Meccan book religion. And finally, the text itself contains over 300 Syriac, Aramaic, and Greek loanwords. This strongly suggests it was born into a highly interconnected, late antique environment, not an isolated desert town.
Which brings us nicely to Section 3, the Islamic dilemma. This right here is the exact logical trap the source presents, and it's a brilliant historical puzzle. The Quran explicitly commands Jews and Christians to judge by the Torah and Gospel that were literally currently in their hands during the 7th century. But how on earth do we reconcile that explicit authentication with the Quran's outright denial of those exact texts' core historical claims, like the crucifixion and deity of Jesus? It creates a massive internal tension.
To try and resolve this tension, Islamic theology developed the doctrine of Tahrif, or textual corruption. Now, what's super interesting is that early Islamic exegesis actually only alleged a distortion of meaning, basically arguing, hey, Jews and Christians are just misinterpreting their perfectly intact books. But as later Islamic scholars learned more about the actual physical contents of the Bible, claiming a mere misinterpretation just wasn't going to cut it anymore. They were forced into a massive theological shift, essentially accusing Jews and Christians of committing actual physical forgery in order to explain away these glaring theological differences. And that creates a very sharp two-horned dilemma. On one hand, horn A, if the Bible was perfectly preserved in the 7th century, well, then the Quran fundamentally contradicts the authenticated witness of the very texts it claims to confirm. But on the other hand, horn B, if the Bible was already physically corrupted and forged by that time, then the Quran is actively commanding obedience to and asking for verification from a deceptive forgery.
When you map this all out, holding both of those claims simultaneously without remainder becomes intellectually strained, strictly based on the Quran's own 7th century premises. The whole physical forgery argument wasn't their initial stance, you know? It only became a strict theological necessity when the earlier meaning distortion argument could no longer protect the broader system from the historical reality of the biblical text circulating at the time.
Pivoting now to Section 4, the Promise Plan Alternative. While Islamic legal theory relies heavily on this concept of Naskh, or abrogation, biblical theology operates on an entirely different structure. Abrogation is essentially a mechanism used to manage differences or solve perceived contradictions by having later divine rulings literally cancel out or replace the earlier revelations. The constructive biblical alternative presented by the source, drawing from Walter C. Kaiser Jr., relies on deep structural continuity rather than replacement or cancellation.
According to the source, biblical revelation is a single, progressively specified oath. It unfolds organically across these distinct historical phases. It starts way back with the initial promise in Genesis, moves forward into the Abrahamic oath, takes a national form at Sinai, establishes the Davidic royal house, deepens through the new covenant internalization, and finally culminates in the incarnate Messiah. The key takeaway here is that across all of these phases, the later developments never cancel or abrogate the earlier covenants. Actually, scratch the idea of cancellation entirely. They actively build upon and fulfill them.
Contrasting abrogation with fulfillment reveals a fundamentally different approach to historical promises. The Promise Plan theology absolutely refuses the idea that the Christian Church simply supersedes, abrogates, or completely replaces ethnic Israel. Instead, it argues for an organic, interconnected fulfillment. The original historical promises made in the text remain entirely irrevocable. They serve as the very foundation for the whole shebang, everything that follows.
Finally, we reach Section 5, Two Views of Revelation.
The core conceptual contrast here is absolutely profound. Under the concept of Inlibration, revelation is literally a text. Therefore, ordinary manuscript variations like scraped pages, missing vowels, or spelling changes, they actively threaten the core dogma of divine letter-perfect dictation. Whereas under Incarnation, the revelation is grounded in an oath and a person operating within real, messy history. Because the ultimate revelation is a person rather than a flawless book, textual variants don't destroy the foundational faith at all. They just refine the ordinary historical transmission of the message.
Bringing this all together, we see stark differences across the board regarding how these traditions interact with history. Take the human medium, for example. In one framework, the human is merely a passive receiver of dictation, making the text highly vulnerable to physical transmission errors. In the other framework, the human authors are active historical witnesses whose distinct voices and contexts are actually a vital part of the organic fulfillment process. It shows that the very definition of revelation itself shapes exactly how deeply a faith can engage with historical critique.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final, provocative thought derived from our source text. Does a religion's very definition of revelation, defining it as a flawless book versus a person embedded in history, fundamentally change its ability to handle the messiness of physical evidence? It's a profound framework for understanding not just textual history, but the deep foundational theologies that our modern world still wrestles with today.